The year was 1941, and the German war machine was pointing its nose directly at the Soviet Union. If the English Channel had been a miserable, terrifying meat grinder for the Stuka pilots, the Eastern Front was about to feel like a paid vacation. When the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, the Soviet Air Force was utterly unprepared. The Russians had massive numbers of planes, but many of them were obsolete, open-cockpit biplanes or early monoplanes that were parked in tight, neat rows on airfields directly in the path of the German advance. The Luftwaffe arrived at dawn, and they didn't knock. Thousands of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground before their pilots could even put their boots on. Within a few weeks, the Germans had reclaimed absolute, undisputed air superiority. The sky belonged to them again. For the Stuka, it was a return to the glory days of Poland and France. The rules of Blitzkrieg were back in effect. The Bf-109s swept the few surviving Russian fighters from the sky, while the Ju-87s operated with impunity. And the targets were enormous. The Soviet military favored massive concentrations of force, entire divisions of men, artillery, and tanks packed together on the wide-open steppes. For a precision dive bomber designed to drop a 500-kilogram explosive into a space the size of a living room, a column of 1,000 Russian supply trucks was less a military target and more like shooting fish in a barrel with a very large shotgun. The pace of operations was staggering. A Stuka crew on the Eastern Front didn't fly 1 or 2 missions a day. They flew from dawn until the light failed. A pilot would take off, dive on a Soviet tank column, drop his bomb, fly back to the dirt airstrip, grab a cup of coffee, while the ground crew furiously winched another 500-kilo bomb onto the trapeze rack and belted new ammunition into the wings, and then he would take off again. 4, 5, sometimes 6 sorties a day. The crews worked themselves to the bone. The mechanics were sleep-deprived zombies covered in grease and glycol. The pilots were fueled by adrenaline, amphetamines, and the sheer momentum of continuous victory. Out of this brutal, endless churn emerged men who transcended the normal limits of human endurance. One pilot in particular stands out. We won't name him because his story isn't about him. It's about what the Stuka allowed a fanatic to achieve. This pilot was not your typical dashing, hard-drinking fighter jock. He didn't socialize in the officers' club. He didn't chase women. He drank milk. He lifted weights. And he flew. He was a machine bolted to a larger machine. In a normal war, a combat pilot might fly 50 to 100 missions before he is killed, captured, or rotated home with shattered nerves. This pilot flew 2,530 missions. That number is not a typo. 2,530 combat dives. He didn't just survive, he annihilated everything in his path. He is credited with sinking a Soviet battleship, a cruiser, a destroyer, and 70 landing craft. But his most terrifying achievement was against armor. He destroyed over 500 Soviet tanks. Let that sink in. One man, in an obsolete airplane that struggled to reach 240 miles per hour, destroyed enough tanks to equip several entire armored divisions. He was shot down over 30 times by anti-aircraft fire. He was wounded 5 times. Toward the end of the war, a Soviet anti-aircraft shell blew off his right leg below the knee. Most men would have taken the honorable discharge. He waited for a crude prosthetic leg to be fitted, climbed back into his Stuka, and flew hundreds more missions, destroying more tanks while bleeding through his bandages. But the East was not a permanent vacation. The Soviet Union was reeling, but it wasn't dead. The sheer geographic scale of Russia bought them time. The Soviets loaded entire airplane and tank factories onto trains and shipped them east of the Ural Mountains, far beyond the reach of German bombers, and out of those factories poured a new generation of weapons. The most famous of these was the T-34 tank. It had sloped armor that was thick enough to bounce standard anti-tank shells like they were pebbles. A regular 500-kilogram bomb dropped by a Stuka would only destroy a T-34 if it was a direct hit. A near miss would flip the dirt but leave the tank perfectly functional. The German response to the T-34 was an act of pure desperation. If dropping bombs wasn't working, they decided to change the weapon. Remember the beautiful aerodynamic lines of the British Spitfire? The German engineers took the exact opposite approach with the Stuka. They took a standard Ju-87, stripped off the dive brakes and the bomb trapeze, and bolted 2 massive 37mm flak cannons directly under the wings in large, drag-inducing pods. They called it the Ju-87G Kanonenvogel, the cannon bird. It was a triumph of offensive firepower and a total nightmare for aerodynamics. The 37mm cannons fired armor-piercing shells with tungsten cores that could punch straight through the thinner top and rear armor of a Soviet tank. It turned the Stuka into the world's first dedicated tank-killing aircraft. But the cost was crippling. Those massive cannon pods hanging in the slipstream acted like anchors. The cannon bird's top speed plummeted to barely 200 miles per hour. When the pilot fired the guns, the enormous recoil would violently jerk the plane in the air, shuddering the entire airframe and bleeding off even more precious speed. It was like strapping two sledgehammers to a kite. If the sky was empty of enemy fighters, the Kanonenvogel was a grim reaper. The pilot would approach a Soviet tank from the rear at low altitude, just 30 or 40 feet off the ground, wait until the engine deck of the T-34 filled his crosshairs, and fire a short burst of the 37mm cannons. The tungsten core would penetrate the engine grill, ignite the fuel, and turn the tank into a burning coffin. Our fanatic pilot claimed most of his 500 tank kills this way. But by 1943, the sky over Russia was no longer empty. The Soviet Air Force had woken up. They were churning out tens of thousands of modern, capable fighter planes. The Yakovlev Yak-9, the Lavochkin La-5, and later the incredible La-7. These were sleek, fast monoplanes flown by a new generation of aggressive, highly motivated Soviet pilots who wanted revenge for 1941. The math of the English Channel returned with a vengeance. The Soviet fighters were significantly faster, more maneuverable, and heavily armed, and worse, they figured out the Stuka's fatal weakness. The Soviet pilots realized that they didn't need to fight the German fighter escorts up high. They just needed to wait down low, near the front lines. They knew that when a Stuka began its vertical dive, it was committed. For 15 terrifying seconds, the German pilot was flying in a perfectly straight line, staring at his target, physically unable to twist or maneuver. He was locked in a predictable trajectory. When the Stuka finally released its bomb and pulled out of the dive, it was at its most vulnerable. The pilot would be momentarily stunned by the heavy G-forces. The aircraft would be slow, having bled off all its diving speed in the violent pull-up maneuver. It was a heavy, wallowing target crawling away from the ground at a few hundred feet of altitude. That was when the Soviet fighters struck. They didn't dogfight. They fell upon the climbing Stukas from the sides and below, tearing into them with heavy cannon and machine gun fire. For the exhausted Stuka rear gunners, it was 1940 all over again. The slow, lumbering cannon birds were even easier prey. The meat grinder began spinning at full speed. In the summer of 1941, the German Stuka wings on the Eastern Front had been losing perhaps 10 planes a month. By late 1943, those losses skyrocketed to 40, 50, even 60 aircraft per month. The Soviet fighters were slaughtering them. The elite veteran pilots who had survived Poland, France, and the early days in Russia were being killed off. They were replaced by young, inexperienced men who were rushed through training, thrown into the meat grinder, and shot down within weeks. Some Stuka groups were entirely wiped out, rebuilt with new planes and men, and then wiped out again. The attrition rate was staggering. The Germans tried desperately to replace the Stuka with a heavily armored ground attack version of the Focke-Wulf 190 fighter, but German factories were being bombed into rubble by the Americans and British, and they could never build enough replacements. So the Stuka kept flying, right up until the bitter, bloody end in 1945. They flew until there was no fuel left to put in their tanks. They flew until the Soviet tanks were literally driving onto the German airfields. When historians tally the final brutal statistics of the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, the numbers tell the true story of the terrifying machine. The Germans built roughly 6,500 Stukas during the war. By the end of the war, over 5,000 of them had been destroyed. That is an attrition rate of 77%. More than three-quarters of all Stukas ever built were shot out of the sky, crashed on takeoff or landing, or blown up on the ground by enemy bombs. The human cost was even worse. A lost airplane meant the loss of two highly specialized men, a dive bomber pilot and a trained rear gunner/radio operator. The Luftwaffe lost thousands of its absolute best men to a stubborn refusal to abandon an obsolete concept. The Stuka was the aircraft that made Blitzkrieg work. It was a terrifying, brilliant piece of engineering that perfectly executed the job it was designed to do: drop an explosive onto a very specific target from a perfectly vertical angle. It destroyed more ships, tanks, and bunkers than any other single weapon of the early war. But the Jericho Trumpet, the howling siren that became the very sound of terror, was ultimately a lie. It was the weapon of a bully. It was designed to shatter the minds of soldiers cowering in trenches to terrorize refugees on open roads, and to dominate a sky where it faced no real opposition. It relied entirely on the arrogance of the German war machine, operating under the assumption that the enemy would never have the tools to fight back. But the moment the enemy stood up, the moment the British launched their Spitfires backed by radar, the moment the Soviets built the Lavochkin fighters and learned the Stuka's predictable geometry, the terror evaporated. The most fearsome sound in the world turned out to be the loudest possible advertisement for exactly where you were, how slow you were going, and how completely helpless you were about to be. The screaming siren didn't stop because someone dismantled the Stukas. The siren stopped because the Stukas simply stopped coming home. August 1940, a young German radio operator named Klaus was sitting backwards in the tiny rear seat of a Junkers Ju 87 Stuka, sweating profusely inside his heavy leather flight suit. He was cramped, his knees pulled up, staring out the back of the greenhouse canopy. His hands gripped the cold metal of an MG-15 machine gun, a single 7.9mm weapon that looked roughly as threatening as a garden hose. Below him was the dark, choppy water of the English Channel, 21 miles of it. To Klaus and his pilot up front, it felt like crossing a large river. They had just crushed the armies of Poland, Norway, Holland, Belgium, and France. A damp little island wasn't going to stop the German war machine. The Luftwaffe's plan for invading Britain, Operation Sea Lion, was stunningly simple. First, the Stukas would fly over the Channel and blow every British radar station, airstrip, and Royal Navy ship to splinters. Second, the invasion barges would cross over. Third, everyone would be home for Christmas. The math seemed solid. The logic seemed flawless. The pilots were utterly convinced of their own invincibility. There was just one tiny, catastrophic flaw in the plan. They were about to fight a war that the British had been preparing for since 1936. The problem wasn't the English Channel. The problem was what the British had built behind the White Cliffs of Dover. The Germans were used to fighting armies that didn't know they were coming until the bombs actually started blowing up the barracks. Surprise, overwhelming force, and terror. That was the Blitzkrieg recipe. But the British didn't play fair. They had built a cheat code right into their coastline. It was called the Dowding system, named after Hugh Dowding, a brilliant, abrasive Air Chief Marshal who realized that airplanes were getting too fast for traditional spotters with binoculars to track. So he built a chain of towering metal radio masts all along the southern and eastern coasts of England. This was Chain Home, the first integrated radar network in the world. It shot invisible radio waves over the Channel. When those waves bounced off a metal object like a formation of 80 Stukas, they returned a signal. The moment Klaus and his pilot crossed the French coast, they weren't sneaking up on anyone. The British operators, sitting in dark rooms filled with cathode ray screens, knew exactly how many planes were coming, what altitude they were at, and what direction they were flying. By the time the Stukas were halfway across the water, women in underground plotting rooms were using long wooden pushers to slide wooden blocks across giant maps, tracking the Germans' every move in real time. The RAF fighters didn't take off and patrol the empty sky, wasting fuel. They sat on the ground drinking tea until the phone rang. Then they were scrambled and vectored by radio controllers directly onto an intercept course with mathematical precision. The Stukas thought they were launching a surprise attack, but the British were already standing at the front door with a loaded shotgun. And oh, what a shotgun it was! Klaus, scanning the sky behind his Stuka, had heard rumors about the British planes. Up until now, the Luftwaffe had fought Polish biplanes and French fighters that were flown with bravery but equipped with mediocrity. But the British had the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane. Let's talk about the horrific physics of the Stuka meeting a Spitfire. The Stuka was a purpose-built precision bomber. It was built to dive straight down at 370 miles per hour, drop a bomb, and pull up without snapping its wings. To survive that stress, it was heavily braced and ugly. Its maximum level flying speed, flat out, engine screaming, was about 240 miles per hour. The Spitfire Mark I was a thoroughbred racehorse built out of aluminum. It had a sleek, fully enclosed cockpit, retractable landing gear, and a massive Rolls-Royce Merlin V12 engine that roared with 1,000 horsepower. Its top speed was 360 miles per hour. That is a 120 mile per hour speed difference. If a Stuka was a heavily loaded farm tractor, the Spitfire was a Ferrari. The Stuka couldn't outrun it, it couldn't outclimb it, it couldn't outturn it, and most terrifying of all, it couldn't dive away from it because the Spitfire's sleek design meant it would outdive the Stuka, catch it, and literally fly right past it on the way down. But the speed wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the teeth. Specifically, 8.303 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 built into each wing of the Spitfire. The British engineers had synchronized the guns to converge their fire at exactly 250 yards in front of the propeller. When a Spitfire pilot pressed the firing button on his control stick, 8 streams of lead instantly merged into a single concentrated cone of absolute destruction. That cone ripped through aluminum skin, severed hydraulic lines, ignited fuel vapor, and shattered human bone in a fraction of a second. A 2-second burst dumped over 150 bullets directly into an enemy plane. On August 8, 1940, the Stukas made their first major assault on a British coastal convoy codenamed Peewit. The Germans sent 82 Stukas, escorted by a heavy screen of Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. They flew in their tight V formations, confident that the 109's flying top cover would swat away any British resistance. But the 109s had a fatal strategic flaw. To protect the slow, lumbering Stukas, the German fighters had to throttle back and fly at the Stukas' agonizingly slow pace. A fighter plane is only safe when it's going fast. By slowing down to babysit the bombers, the 109s gave away their only advantage, energy. They wallowed in the sky, easy targets. The British radar network picked up the enormous raid immediately. The controllers scrambled the Hurricanes and Spitfires and placed them 20,000 feet in the air, directly in the path of the incoming Germans, with the sun at their backs. When the British dove out of the glare, it was a slaughter. The Spitfires fell through the Bf-109 escort screen like sharks swimming through minnows. Because they had started high, they came down with overwhelming kinetic energy. A Spitfire diving at 400 miles per hour was practically invisible until it opened fire. Down in the back of his Stuka, Klaus's worst nightmare became reality. Remember his weapon? A single rear-facing 7.9mm MG-15 machine gun. Let's do the math on Klaus's chances of survival. He is sitting in a plane moving 240 miles per hour. A Spitfire is diving at him from the rear at 400 miles per hour. The closure rate is 160 miles per hour, or roughly 230 feet per second. Klaus has about 3 seconds to twist his heavy machine gun around, aim at a violently maneuvering speck in the sky, calculate the deflection, and fire. And he's trying to do this while his own pilot is violently jerking the Stuka side to side to avoid getting hit. Trying to shoot down a Spitfire with a single MG-15 is like trying to swat a charging rhinoceros with a wet piece of spaghetti. The Spitfire pilot simply lined up the broad, slow wings of the Stuka, squeezed the trigger, watched the plane erupt in a shower of sparks and glycol coolant, and pulled up and away before Klaus could even track him in his sights. The sky over the channel turned into a graveyard. Stukas were blown clean in half. Some exploded into brilliant orange fireballs when the converging fire hit their full fuel tanks. Others had their tails sawed off by the sheer volume of lead, tumbling end over end toward the cold water below. The air filled with white parachutes, though many crews never had the chance to bail out. The German formation discipline, which had crushed Poland, became a death sentence. The tight V formations made them easy to find and impossible to scatter quickly. They were sitting ducks. By the end of August 8th, the Stuka force had lost 16 aircraft destroyed and many more damaged beyond repair. For a highly specialized force built around elite, 2-man crews, 16 planes in a single day was catastrophic. It was nearly a 20% loss rate. You do not need a degree in statistics to realize that if you lose 20% of your force every time you take off, you are going to run out of airplanes very quickly. 10 days later, on August 18, 1940, a day the British would later call the hardest day, the disaster became permanent. The Luftwaffe threw everything at the RAF airfields in southern England. The veteran pilots of Sturzkampfgeschwader 77, the famous Stuka Wing 77 that had been winning medals since day one of the war, were sent to bomb the airfields at Gosport and Thorney Island. They were the best dive bomber pilots the Third Reich had to offer. The British radar saw them forming up over France. The controllers sent the Spitfires up early. They were waiting. Over Thorney Island, the Spitfires struck. The massacre was so absolute it stunned even the hardened German veterans. One Spitfire pilot attacked a Stuka, fired a 2-second burst into its engine block, and watched the massive Junkers Jumo inverted V-12 engine simply seize solid. The propeller snapped to a dead stop. The heavy, unaerodynamic airplane instantly turned into a falling rock. Another Spitfire attacked an entire flight of 3 Stukas, damaging all 3 in a single pass. The rear gunners fought with unbelievable desperation. One gunner continued to fire even after a cannon shell shattered his arm, and another kept firing his MG-15 while simultaneously trying to fly the airplane from the back seat after his pilot was killed by a bullet through the brain. But bravery doesn't stop bullets, and it doesn't bend physics. The Stuka was too slow, too poorly armed to defend itself, and completely outclassed. By the time the sun set on August 18th, Sturzkampfgeschwader 77 had been gutted. They lost 12 planes completely destroyed and another 14 so badly shot up they would never fly again. Total Stuka losses for that one day across all units were 16 dead aircraft. In less than 2 weeks, the Luftwaffe had lost over 40 Stukas, and more importantly, they lost 80 highly trained, irreplaceable crew members. That night, at the Luftwaffe headquarters at Cap Blanc-Nez, overlooking the Dark Channel, there was a quiet, panicked meeting. The squadron commanders laid out the terrifying math for Hermann Göring. The Stuka could not survive over England, period. The Bf 109 escorts couldn't protect them without crippling themselves, and the British fighters were simply too fast and too heavily armed. The weapon that had conquered Europe was being turned into scrap metal. The decision was made in secret. They couldn't announce it to the German public, who had spent the last year watching propaganda films touting the Stuka as the invincible sword of the Reich. There were no press conferences, there was no official document released. But on the morning of August 19th, the order went down. The Ju-87 Stuka was immediately, permanently withdrawn from the Battle of Britain. It would never fly another major mission over English soil. The psychological terror weapon had been utterly terrified. The screaming sirens that had driven French soldiers insane were silenced not by a better bomb, but by the brutal reality of a superior machine. The German pilots learned the hardest lesson in aviation. An airplane is only invincible until the enemy builds a faster one, but the Stuka wasn't dead. It wasn't even close. The Luftwaffe just needed a place to send a slow, heavy, incredibly accurate flying artillery piece where it wouldn't be bullied by Spitfires. They needed a place where the enemy planes were sitting helplessly on the ground. They needed the east, and in the vast, freezing expanse of Russia, the Stuka was about to rack up a body count that defied human comprehension, turning a handful of fanatical pilots into the deadliest tank killers in the history of warfare. At 2 p.m. on May 13, 1940, a French artillery corporal sat inside a reinforced concrete bunker near the town of Sedan, sipping lukewarm coffee and smoking a crushed Gauloise's cigarette. He felt remarkably safe. The walls around him were 10 feet of poured concrete and steel rebar. He was part of the French defensive line anchoring the Meuse River, and military academy textbooks had assured him that his position was practically impregnable. He wasn't worried about tanks. The Ardennes forest was supposedly too thick for German armor to pass through. He wasn't worried about infantry. They had interlocking fields of machine gun fire, and he certainly wasn't worried about airplanes. In 1940, airplanes were flimsy things made of aluminum and canvas that dropped bombs with the accuracy of a drunk throwing darts blindfolded. Then he heard the sound. It didn't sound like a falling bomb. It didn't sound like a roaring engine. It sounded like the sky itself was being torn in half. It was a mechanical shrieking wail that started as a low, ominous moan and rapidly climbed into a deafening, ear-piercing scream. The corporal dropped his cigarette. The coffee spilled. The noise vibrated through the 10 feet of concrete, rattling his teeth in his skull. It was a sound engineered in a laboratory specifically to bypass the logical part of the human brain and claw directly at the primal nerve of absolute terror. He looked through the firing slit just in time to see an incredibly ugly cranked-wing airplane plunging out of the clouds, pointed almost completely vertically at the earth, screaming like a demon ripped from hell. Seconds later, a 500-kilogram bomb smashed through the roof of the adjacent bunker, turning 20 men and 2 heavy cannons into a cloud of pulverized dust. The French corporal didn't know it yet, but the era of the impenetrable fortress was dead. It had just been killed by a machine called the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. To understand why the Stuka was so revolutionary and ultimately so doomed, you have to look at the machine itself, and let's be honest, it was a profoundly ugly piece of equipment. Most fighter planes of the era, like the British Spitfire, were sleek, beautiful thoroughbreds. The Stuka looked like a vulture that had swallowed a piano. It had thick, inverted gull wings that cranked down and then up, making it look broken. Sitting directly under the nose was a massive, jutting radiator that resembled a permanent underbite. But the most ridiculous feature was the landing gear. While modern planes tucked their wheels inside their wings to reduce drag, the Stuka's landing gear was bolted firmly in place, hanging down like thick bird talons covered in oversized metal pants called spats. When British and American aviation intelligence officers first looked at photos of the Ju-87 in the late 1930s, they laughed into their teacups. They looked at the aerodynamic drag created by those fixed wheels and the boxy greenhouse-style canopy. They looked at the top speed, which was a pathetic 240 miles per hour. For context, that was slower than a flock of angry geese on a tailwind. The British dismissed it as an obsolete relic, a flying brick that belonged in a museum alongside biplanes and zeppelins. They couldn't fathom why the German Luftwaffe was mass-producing a plane so utterly outclassed by modern engineering. What the Allied experts missed was that they were judging a sledgehammer by the metrics of a scalpel. The Germans didn't care that the Stuka was slow. They didn't care that it maneuvered like a loaded dump truck. They only cared about one thing: gravity. In the late 1930s, the standard method for bombing a target from the air was called level bombing. You flew high, you flew flat, and your bombardier looked through a complex mechanical sight covered in dials and knobs, trying to calculate wind speed, altitude, and the rotation of the Earth. When he finally dropped the bombs, they tumbled for thousands of feet. If a high-altitude bomber squadron aimed at a bridge, they were statistically likely to hit the river, the town next to the river, a nearby farm, and maybe an unlucky cow. Hitting the actual bridge was considered a minor miracle. The Navy pilots had a joke for this. They called it hole-in-the-water bombing. The German General Staff knew that if they wanted to conquer Europe quickly, they couldn't wait around for high-altitude bombers to miss their targets. They needed a way to break roadblocks, bunkers, and bridges exactly when the tanks needed them broken. They needed flying artillery. Enter the dive bomber. The physics of the Stuka were brutally simple. Instead of flying flat and trying to do complex math, the Stuka pilot just flew directly over the target, rolled the plane onto its back, and pulled the nose straight down. We are not talking about a gentle glide. We are talking about a 70 to 80-degree vertical plunge. The pilot looked through a sight mounted on his cockpit floor, placing the crosshairs directly on top of the target, and aimed the entire airplane like a giant lawn dart. Because the bomb was falling almost vertically, there was practically no forward drift to calculate. Wind barely affected it. When a Stuka pilot released his bomb at 1,500 feet, he wasn't aiming for a general area. He was aiming for a specific window, a specific tank, or a specific anti-aircraft gun. The accuracy wasn't measured in hundreds of yards, it was measured in meters. But doing this requires a plane built like a tank. If you point a normal airplane straight down at the ground and open the throttle, the sheer force of the air rushing over the wings at that speed will rip the airframe to confetti. The ugliness of the Stuka was its strength. It was heavily reinforced. It had massive hydraulically operated dive brakes under the wings, essentially large metal slats that flipped down to act like parachutes, keeping the plane's diving speed from exceeding 370 miles per hour so the wings wouldn't fly off. There was just one biological problem: the meat in the pilot's seat. Plunging vertically toward the Earth and then violently pulling the nose up to avoid crashing generates enormous gravitational forces. The G-forces would push the pilot's blood out of his brain and down into his legs. During the pullout, a Stuka pilot weighed over 1,000 pounds. Almost every pilot who executed a proper dive attack blacked out for several seconds. If a pilot blacks out while flying at 300 miles per hour, 1,000 feet above the ground, he wakes up dead. So, the Junkers engineers built an automatic pull-out system. The pilot would set his release altitude on a dial, he would press a button on his control stick to start the dive, and the plane's autopilot would take over. When the altimeter hit the preset mark, the bomb would automatically release, and the hydraulic system would forcefully yank the control surfaces, throwing the plane out of the dive. The pilot would regain consciousness a few seconds later, climbing away from the target as the smoking crater faded into the distance behind him. But the Germans didn't just want to destroy the enemy's bunkers, they wanted to destroy their minds. A general named Ernst Udet had a profoundly dark idea. He ordered small propeller-driven sirens to be bolted to the leading edge of the Stuka's fixed landing gear. As the plane entered its steep dive, the rushing air would spin the siren blades. The result was the Jericho Trumpet. It wasn't just loud, it was an acoustic weapon. The pitch increased as the plane plummeted faster and faster, creating a sound that mimicked a human scream trapped inside a jet turbine. When the German Panzer divisions smashed into Poland in September 1939, the world got its first taste of Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The Stuka was the thunder. Every German tank division was assigned a dedicated squadron of U-87s. When a German tank commander ran into a tough Polish bunker, he didn't call for the infantry to charge it, and he didn't wait hours for heavy artillery to be dragged up through the mud. He simply picked up a radio, called a forward air controller in a specially equipped half-track, and gave them the coordinates. 15 minutes later, the sky above the Polish defenders would fill with ugly, cranked-wing airplanes. The sirens would begin to howl. The psychological effect is hard to overstate. The Polish cavalry and infantry were brave men, hardened veterans who were fully prepared to fight and die against tanks and guns. But no amount of bravery prepares you for the sky screaming at you. Entire units dissolved into panic. Men threw down their rifles and covered their ears, curling into the fetal position in their trenches. Horses stampeded. The accuracy of the bombs was almost secondary to the paralyzing terror of the noise. The Stuka broke their will to fight before the bomb even hit the ground. The Polish campaign was over in a month. The world watched the newsreel footage, deliberately distributed by the Nazi propaganda ministry, showing screaming Stukas turning cities into rubble. The pilots became rock stars in Germany. They walked through the streets of Berlin in their tailored uniforms, treated like invincible knights of the air, and they fully believed their own hype. They thought they were untouchable, because in Poland they were. The Polish Air Force had fought bravely, but they were flying outdated biplanes and early monoplanes that were quickly swept from the sky by the Stukas' escorts, the deadly Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Once the sky belonged to the Germans, the Stukas operated like VIPs on a private runway. In May 1940, the German war machine turned its attention to France. The French generals were supremely confident. They had the largest army in Western Europe. They had thousands of tanks. They had the Maginot Line. They looked at the rapid fall of Poland and blamed it on Polish backwardness, comfortable in the belief that modern French concrete and steel would stop the Germans cold. They were about to learn a brutal lesson in physics and acoustics when the German armored spearhead punched through the Ardennes forest, a region the French had arrogantly declared impassable to tanks. They reached the Meuse River at Sedan. The French defenders on the opposite bank were heavily entrenched. A standard military crossing would have required days of artillery preparation and cost thousands of lives. Instead, the Luftwaffe ordered the greatest close air support operation in history. For 5 unbroken hours, waves of Stukas descended on the French positions. As soon as one group of Ju-87s released their bombs and turned back to Germany to rearm, another group was already rolling over into their dives. The sky over Sedan was a continuous howling escalator of plunging metal. The Jericho Trumpet screamed without a single moment of silence from noon until 5 o'clock in the evening. The French troops locked inside their impenetrable bunkers didn't just die, they lost their minds. Imagine sitting in a concrete box for 5 hours, unable to see the sky, while the sound of a mechanical banshee drills into your skull every 30 seconds, followed by the earth-shattering concussion of a 1,000-pound bomb landing just outside the door. The concussions sucked the air out of their lungs. The noise scrambled their thoughts. When the German infantry finally crossed the river in inflatable rubber boats, they found many of the French bunkers completely intact, the concrete uncracked, but the men inside were shattered. They were weeping, shaking, and surrendering to the first grey uniform they saw. The Stukas hadn't destroyed the French defenses. They had destroyed the men holding the rifles. France fell in 6 weeks. It was a military collapse so sudden and complete that it stunned the world. The Stuka was hailed as the undisputed king of the battlefield. The plane that the British experts had dismissed as an ugly, slow, obsolete relic had just dismantled the 2 largest armies in Europe. The Stuka pilots were arrogant, flush with victory, and convinced that nothing could stop them. They parked their planes on the captured airfields along the French coast and looked out across the English Channel. It was just 21 miles of cold salt water. On the other side was a stubborn island nation that refused to surrender. The German High Command drew up the plans for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. The strategy was exactly the same. The Stukas would obliterate the coastal radars, sink the Royal Navy in the harbors, and blast the defensive pillboxes on the beaches to dust. The pilots drank captured French champagne and boasted about how quickly they would bring London to its knees. They didn't know it yet, but the honeymoon was over. The Stuka had spent the last 10 months fighting armies that had no roof. It was about to fly into a country that had built the most sophisticated ceiling in the world. And the sky above England was filled with a machine that didn't care about sirens or dive brakes. It only cared about speed, and it had 8 machine guns waiting to prove a point.